Aren't you ever curious about how different Christmas used to be? 100 years ago, they were eating things you and I couldn't even imagine, and now we're doing the same. American holiday traditions have transformed beyond recognition in just a century, and it's absolutely a must to see just how wild it's gotten. So, the thing with traditional roast goose is that it's probably one of the most ancient Christmas dinners we have, and that's not just limited to the United States of America, but honestly, it applies the most to us. The goose was always associated with pagan winter traditions in some areas, with geese being such active habitat-hopping birds, but it was most popular to hunt them during the winter season. If you caught them even earlier, say, during the fall, then you'd spend the months fattening them so that they'd make for a good feast. Goose fat was really popular too for its health benefits. In general, the use of geese in particular was always linked with a good time, peace, and full stomachs all around. Unfortunately, it was somewhere along the 19th and 20th centuries that roast turkey's dominance began to fade away. It found itself losing badly to turkey, which was already a thing in America since the 16th century, but never gained this kind of mainstream power. There was good reason for people to make the switch too, since preparing a turkey and farming one was significantly easier than catching geese every winter. Also, they weren't even half as fatty, and the general perspective on immensely fatty game has changed a lot since the 19th century. Now, people kind of detest the idea. Plus, by the 1910s, everyone was way too used to seeing geese for every feast. Turkey became not only the practical choice, but also the new status symbol. It was the new girl in town, and everyone wants to get with the new girl. Or bird, in this case. Plus, it wasn't just a switch in tastes and health preferences, it was even in the entertainment. Charles Dickens wrote A Christmas Carol around 1843, and it featured a goose as the main dinner, but in later adaptations it got replaced with turkey too. There are still some niche fans of the stuff around, but thanks to a lot of modern food being based around getting takeout, ordering in, or just using pre-made and frozen food to get the job done, the concept of an entire roasted goose just isn't something people want on their tables anymore. Parsley and celery root bisque isn't exactly the first thing you think of when you imagine Christmas, but it's still a pretty celebrated dish in the United States, especially if you go all the way back to the 1920s. Now, this kind of reflects the culture that was popular back then, which basically made use of anything it could scavenge, forage, save, or mix with vegetables so that it would last longer. That wasn't just a thing for the average income households, but even the wealthier ones, because the times were simply that chaotic. In the 1920s, Christmas dinner menus would switch up depending on the state you went to. And I mean, you could get French exotics on one end of the spectrum and eat lamb brain on the other. It was a wild ride, and parsley and celery root bisque found a humble place for themselves in between all of that. Soups and bisques were first just used as an appetizer, something to get you started on the main course, but they became a main dish thanks to the efforts of a lot of French chefs. They're the ones that first introduced the idea of creamy bisque during the very start of the 20th century, and parsley and celery root was just one example of that. It gave a nice earthy base to the soup, and it worked really well with cream and sherry wine. As you're already well aware, there's no one on the planet that knows how to mix wine with food better than the French. It fit the sensation of Christmas, as it was seen as sophisticated, so it made you feel all special when you'd get a bowl, but it was also seen as festive. It was basically the perfect kind of soup to serve since it made sense with the occasion and the season. Plus, food trends in the 1920s were moving more and more towards sophisticated dishes and gourmet dining. So there was a wave of middle-class homes mimicking recipes and techniques used by chefs in fine dining restaurants. In the more affluent neighborhoods, it would be common to include things like roasted chicken, turkey, or oysters too. The thing is, though, America had its fill of soups pretty quickly, and each decade in the 20th century moved a bit more towards fast food than the last one did. Baked ham with pineapple glaze was pretty much the quintessential Christmas dinner experience. You couldn't pass a home in the 1930s without smelling the fragrance of this. It was just the thing to get, especially since Christmases during the 1930s were pretty gloomy thanks to the Great Depression. People did not have a lot to work with, and what they did have, they really needed to be smart about and save it. That meant that you could throw things like a roasted goose or a bisque out the window, because who has the money for cream? That's right, even basic things like milk, cream, and better seasonings were out of the reach of the common man. During the Depression, though, ham was a silver lining, and I don't think there's ever been a better example of one. It was affordable, it came cured and canned, and it could feed a large amount of people in one go. That not only made it ideal for regular use, it made it especially perfect for holidays. When else do you really need to feed a giant amount of people? It made people reconnect with their Christmas spirit because they didn't have to wake up and eat makeshift bread anymore. They could actually enjoy some familiar tastes and have a nice dining experience with their loved ones. Pineapples were just the same. While they never had much mainstream success before this, especially during these times, Americans eventually had to take a note out of Hawaii's book. The pineapple came canned, thanks to bigwig companies like Dole, and it was always marketed as a high-end fruit, but getting a raw pineapple was a lot of work. You needed to have the proper tools to cut it and prepare it. Not that this was really the hardest thing in the world, but it was more energy than the average person had back in the day. Thanks to the canned variants, we had pineapple rings, and thanks to items like Spam, people got more and more accustomed to the idea of a fusion between the sweet and the savory. Plus, pineapples might be divisive as far as tastes are considered, but nobody denies their value in presentation. These things can really make a dish look great, especially glazes. All in all, it worked amazingly well with baked ham, and it let people save a bit more of both since they were using a little of each. Unfortunately, American palates would really start to go towards things like avocado toasts and pastas, rice bowls and curries, things where pineapples just don't make sense. Plus, a lot of people felt like it was better to leave the Depression era cooking in the 1930s because they could finally afford to eat better later. Cauliflower au gratin pretty much had a run similar to what parsley bisque did, in that it was this heavily creamy and vegetable-oriented dish that got popular thanks to preferences and tastes changing according to the harsh time. It wasn't something you'd ever really picture as a Christmas dinner, especially in most homes. Maybe that one vegan neighbor, sure, but the entire block? That was definitely a fever dream until the 1940s happened and World War II became an active thing people had to wake up and live with. It meant that the practice of rationing became extremely common, especially thanks to government efforts and campaigns. Staples like meat, sugar, and butter, even eggs, were rationed off, and people just didn't have the same access to them anymore. That meant that recipes involving vegetables suddenly saw a massive spike in popularity. I mean, how could it not? What else did the people have left to freely work with on an everyday basis? One of those vegetables was the cauliflower. It was a pretty affordable and economic vegetable that was available to everyone, but also had a lot of variety. Home cooks could work with it easily, and they also took some ideas from local communities and their cuisines, such as the Native Americans, which heavily involved using vegetables on an everyday basis. You just needed milk, flour, and cheese, which were hard ingredients to come by but were saved for special occasions like Christmas, to make the bechamel sauce that would work as the base for the au gratin. Then, you would simply top it with whatever cheese you had, or if you couldn't spare any more, a breadcrumb topping, and enjoy the perfectly tender baked cauliflower. It worked amazingly well as this comfort Christmas food that took the edge off from the harsh winters and also filled up everyone's stomachs. It made it perfect to serve alongside roast chicken too, and everybody honestly enjoyed it far more than they ever expected to. Which begs the question, why did they let go of this one? You see, the thing is, processed foods were fast approaching, especially by the 1960s, and these little decade-long flings people have with certain foods are heavily inspired by the kind of situations they find themselves in during those times. Once things settle down and people regain access to all kinds of foods, they're far more likely to go back to old habits rather than adopt new ones. Processed foods played a lot on that and made things that were beloved by everyone even more accessible, and then came things like slow cookers, which really revolutionized how a lot of Americans approached holiday cooking. There wasn't a lot of room left for a cauliflower au gratin to take the stage and dazzle everyone, putting them onto vegetables for the foreseeable future. Let me prove that point to you right now by examining a little bit of what reigned supreme during the 1950s, when the chaos from the war had finally ended and things were going towards peacetime again. People immediately jumped ship on things like bisques and au gratin, and now crown roasts with apricot dressings became the trendy thing to do for Christmas. It was seen as the perfect symbol of elegance during the holiday season, and it was definitely tied strongly together with Christmas. The crown roast looked regal. It gave off an air of importance, as in, if this were being served at the table, you knew that there was a pretty serious occasion too. It was dramatic. It had flair, style, and the ability to catch everyone's eyes. And as a result, after 2 to 3 decades spent living heavily frugal lifestyles, it captivated Americans hook, line, and sinker. After the World War, the United States of America not only headed back towards peaceful days, but also entered prosperous ones. It was a time of economic growth, and the disposable income your average household had went up. Now, even under normal circumstances, that inspires people to live a little bit more lavishly, but the American population after the 30s and 40s was definitely starved, and they wanted to go all out with their money. Splurging on pricey cuts of meat? Buying that one silk bed sheet? Getting a new 3-piece suit made? All an effect of the times, as people would spend their money to gain a sense of that same financial stability they used to always have. That went doubly for food, and the crown roast is a near-perfect example. The preparation was tough. You had to make sure the rib bones would stand just upright so that it would resemble a crown. And the apricot dressing, as vibrant as it is, was a tricky dressing to nail, because everything really needed to work in harmony here. Remember how I was saying that Americans were heading towards the sweet and the savory, plus gaining a knack for gourmet dining? That entire gradual shift in tastes and preferences culminated in the crown roast. It was like the recipe was a challenge to any eager home cook that was laying their eyes on it for the first time. As they'd read the steps, it almost felt like the roast was inviting you to cook it, asking you if you still had the chops as a chef. It's the same today, too. Everybody wants to hop on TikTok and prove that they can make a really fancy culinary marvel from the comfort of their kitchen, so why would people almost a century ago be too different? Plus, crown roasts were the perfect party item, especially in the suburbs. It was something to talk about, gawk at, and discuss, which really made it ideal for large Christmas festivities and celebrations. The thing is, though, Americans love extravagance, but the only thing they love more is convenience. And as time settled, Americans would slowly go all in on that aspect. Crown roasts took a lot of work to make, and it also meant that you had to know your way around a chicken as far as butchering was concerned, which became a skill that was fast fading thanks to canned stuff. Plus, tastes also went more towards foreign cuisines and cultures, like French and Scandinavian cooking. Then, there was also the fact that crown roasts used expensive cuts, and the cost of meat was only rising towards the tail end of the 50s. Also, people were still making the shift to turkey, which was slowly replacing other proteins as the top dog. All of this came together to make sure that the crown roasts would stay in the 50s, though people still vibe with the apricot dressing from time to time even now. So, with meat becoming a bit heavier on the wallet and with tastes going towards things that were lighter on the stomach as well as your finances, roast beef became something of a mass favorite. The post-World War II boom in the economy did continue to the 1960s, and I know that when I say the costs of meat kept going up, that doesn't make too much sense since people should have been able to afford it, right? Well, without going too much into economics, it wasn't that much of a boost that people could afford it annually and regularly. Beef, on the other hand, was still well within the reach of most people's monthly budgets, and thanks to advances in refrigeration and the concept of a fridge becoming something that the public was trying to adapt on a wide scale, beef only became more and more popular. You could now make the same cuts of beef last a lot longer thanks to refrigeration. Also, farming practices were benefiting from new technology too, as transporting beef from cattle farms back to urban cities and hubs was easier than ever, meaning there was more to sell in the markets than ever before. All right, now that the boring stuff is out of the way, let's talk about the actual foodie bits. Roast beef had always been a big part of the West's diet and culinary identity, and no one's denying that. It was a centerpiece for all kinds of celebratory dishes, especially Christmas. Plus, it was also seen as a status symbol. You know how today if we see a family go out for crab every week, we know they're well off? Well, it's the same thing for roast beef in the 60s. If you ever wanted to make your family feel well-fed and taken care of, you'd go for roast beef during the holidays, no question. Plus, it was just built for family dining. You could feed everybody in the house guaranteed and still have leftovers the next day, and who's really going to say that's a bad deal? Plus, thanks to things settling down, most suburbs were in full swing with non-stop parties and celebrations, especially around Christmas. And as a host, it'd be criminal not to have some of the stuff up in the menu. Things like this made it more a status symbol than a recipe, as it took on a life of its own. But if you really got down to it, people were coming for the taste, no matter how much they convinced themselves that it made them seem richer. Don't get me wrong, you definitely weren't hurting if you could afford to splurge on it, but even people that couldn't would save up for it because it just tasted that good. Unfortunately, by the 70s, another round of inflation hit the masses and made large cuts that became a lot more unreasonable as a holiday feast item. Then, health trends also started shifting towards leaner and greener eating, thanks to concerns around the rising rates of heart-related incidents in the youth and the general public. Also, by this point in time, Americans were really committing to exploring other cultures. This is something I've mentioned before too, but it really peaked around these 2 decades. As a result, it became a little uncommon to serve roasted beef. Party loaves were a pretty colorful addition to the holiday menus during the 20th century, especially around the 1907s. They were really detailed, and you had to have a knack for presentation if you were trying to take one on. It involved so much layering with multiple different sandwich fillings and spread between these thin slices of bread that would then be shaped into a loaf. Don't even get me started on the whole frosting it with cream cheese thing. Basically, if you ever wanted to show off and flex your ability to make a dish look pretty and taste good, this was what you would make. Come to think of it, that's pretty on brand for the 1970s, which was probably one of the most prolific decades in American history. It felt like everything was about the glitz and glamour and showing off in creative and colorful ways. A party loaf had a bread base with horizontally sliced bread, and it was most common to use light rye bread. You could also use different colored loaves to achieve even more flair with your presentation. Not that the dish really needed it. Let's get to the fillings, because there's a lot to talk about here. There's egg salad, ham salad, tuna salad, pimento cheese, chicken salad, and a lot more. People would even use dills, olives, pickles, and all kinds of herbs mixed in with this. The frosting of the loaf was entirely built around whipped cream cheese, and some recipes even asked you to use food coloring to follow party themes or explore some holiday decor. It was an extremely colorful dish, and the best part was that the food coloring was probably the most artificial thing about it. Everything it did with its looks, it managed using natural ingredients that were simply arranged in a pretty innovative way. Plus, a lot of holiday feasts and Christmas parties began to follow distinct themes during the 1970s, which meant that there was more of a focus on food presentation than there ever had been in the past. So with all that going for it, why would something like this fade into obscurity? Well, the thing is that the rich, mayo-based filling and all the emphasis on cream cheese didn't align with the changing tastes of the time. People were trying to abandon cream and fatty main courses, not double down on them. And while party loaves were a lovely little one-time thing, they couldn't stay forever. They were also hard to make, and Americans were going more towards convenience food that could work with TV time, which was becoming more and more of an everyday thing for people. Eventually, the idea of a party loaf became something you'd only see in ancient cookbooks. Glazed Cornish hens were this extremely popular holiday dinner in the 1980s that really kept in line with all the changing trends I've been talking about. These were centered a lot on the individual, not on large groups and servings that would take care of your whole family. Instead, a glazed Cornish hen would be adequate for one person, and that really showed Americans an entirely different kind of fun to be had with food. The idea of personalized portions for one person began to take off thanks to dishes like this, and Cornish hens were also a much healthier alternative to everything we've discussed so far. They were refined, luxurious, and seen as sophisticated, so they had a lot of selling points that roasted ham or turkey just couldn't offer up at the time. In the post-war world, thanks to the economic boom, people had a bit more faith in their wallets. However, that was quickly put to a stop by the rising inflation later on too, which definitely started to become a fact of everyday life by the 80s. As a result, people had to find a middle ground they could work with, and Cornish hens were just the perfect thing. Despite their appearance and the general perception being that they were really sophisticated, Cornish hens were super easy to make and prepare. They didn't need a lot of work at all, and that was such a stark contrast from the things Americans typically grew up with, like turkeys and crown roasts. A simple glaze, a roasting pan, and a functioning oven were all you needed for this main dish. Also, here's their ace in the hole. You could actually just make this whole thing ahead of time, keep it in the refrigerator, and then reheat it and serve it when you needed to. This was literally the perfect thing in a post-war world where people were really becoming more and more job and career-focused, working long hours or sometimes even 2 jobs. At the end of the day, coming home to a dish you made on Sunday that you could reheat and have easily on Monday seemed like a blessing. Plus, you could go for a sweet glaze or a savory glaze, so the recipe really managed to earn favor with a lot of different kinds of people. Unfortunately, once people started to make this regularly, they were able to see past their first impressions and understand the dish for what it really was. No matter how it looked, it was just a simple glaze with Cornish hens, and Americans wanted a bit more spice and flavor in their food later on thanks to all the other styles of cooking that they now had firm experience with. Cranberry wild rice pilaf was a hallmark of many 1990s Christmas that people enjoyed. It became the perfect side dish for things like Christmas and Thanksgiving, especially towards the middle part of the decade. You can pretty much credit its success to a lot of the shifts we've discussed so far. Americans want to explore tastes outside of their country. Then you start to mix in the need for healthier eating amongst a sea of rising medical concerns as well as economic costs, and you start to see why things like this were taking over ham, beef, and duck. The 1990s was especially a decade that was surrounded with things like the keto diet, low-fat meals, and high-fiber diets and cookbooks. Wild rice was preferred over the typical white rice as a superior grain thanks to the many nutritional benefits that come with it. Basically, wild rice is a lot lower in calories, and it packs a bigger amount of protein and fiber. In simple terms, that means you get more energy, build more muscle, and also gain less weight for every serving of wild rice compared to every serving of white rice. It was a pretty good package deal, and Americans have never been one to miss a good bargain. Plus, the pre-existing culture around cranberries and Christmas really helped this dish too. Cranberry sales would always spike heavily during Christmas, thanks to all the people making cranberry sauces and desserts. And also, they were always in season. It was a quintessential holiday ingredient. Plus, it agreed with the general preference for vegetarian-based eating. Cranberry wild rice pilaf fit perfectly into all sorts of greener diets, and it was very easy to make, especially in large batches. The thing is, though, so far I've only discussed practical benefits. Sure, it's a dish that's got a lot of utility, but it needs taste and star power to really keep itself going. This dish just didn't have much of that. And as good as it was for a dish that was just wild rice and cranberries, it couldn't last in the face of growing convenience and fast food. If we go into the 2000s, we can find green bean almondine, which is a pretty classic French dish. I won't say this disappeared entirely like the rest of the items on the list, but it's definitely not in its glory days. Still, it was the popular thing to make for a while, even if its run got cut short later on. It was seen as an elegant dish perfect for formal dinners, so it was very popular in upper-class circles. Green bean almondine's biggest trait was its tender but crispy green beans that were mixed in this very buttery sauce served with toasted almonds. As far as health goes, you really can't outdo this. One of the reasons people began to look towards other cultures so much was that they wanted ideas on how to diversify their cooking and make it healthier, since American cookbooks simply weren't the best for that. Luckily, the French had lots of ideas for that, and almondine was something people took happily from French-American communities and restaurant menus. They would often experiment with non-traditional ways to make the sauces too, and a lot of variations came out, some of which didn't even involve green beans. Still, green beans weren't ever exactly Uncle Sam's favorite vegetable, and a lot of the masses would agree with that sentiment. Things like broccoli and asparagus would eventually take over, and the 2000s also saw something else that no other decade really had to deal with. They had all these pre-packaged side dishes and frozen vegetables, and a lot of these were pre-made and didn't even need to be microwaved. Plus, work culture was busier than ever, especially thanks to all kinds of new technical and desk jobs popping up thanks to advancements in computers and technology. People wanted practical, easy-to-make food that could even be prepared using convenience food that was already available in stores. There was a big shift towards pre-packaged and frozen stuff, and green bean almondine couldn't keep up with all that. Over time, it simply faded away, as did many things from the 2000s, despite how they were only 20-odd years ago. In the 2010s, and I'm sure a lot of you can remember this, standing rib roasts were the undisputed top dog. It seemed like a complete 180 too. It felt like the general stance went from, "We need keto, our kids need to eat more vegetables," back to as much McDonald's as a human stomach can possibly contain. Somewhere along the line, standing rib roasts became the ideal Christmas meal. It had already been a staple for so long in American culture, so it wasn't like people were doing anything that was very innovative or new, but the 2000s have been full of attempts at reviving old culture and bringing back dishes and cooking practices from the 20th century as much as they've been about exploring new frontiers. With rib roasts, there was this need for a return to classic comfort foods that people had grown up with. A lot of Americans also grew up on the things we were discussing previously, namely canned, processed food, and they had forgotten the simple joy of working with whole cuts of meat. Nobody knew what it was like to enjoy a prime rib you worked on yourself and one that was prepared strictly in your kitchen. I'm not talking about the packaged ones you can find in a grocery store either. Once people started to rediscover that kind of fun, they began to return to high-quality meats that were cooked properly and traditionally. Plus, there was this entire farm-to-table movement going around, which basically emphasized anti-processing sentiments and focused on organic and natural eating. There was a lot of push from social media, too. You'd always see people showing off their prime ribs or standing rib roasts on Instagram and going viral for it, which really put a focus on presentation that wasn't there in past decades. It drew people in, got them curious, and made them think too. Marbled meats were becoming more and more common, and it was also due to them basically making for really photogenic dishes. Overall, it was these factors that revived the standing rib roast. But what about its decline? Well, alternative, leaner proteins, a focus on gym culture, and yet another wave of vegetarian-based eating, this time stronger than ever, meant that prime ribs became something that were a part of the national conversation again, sure, but were also something people weren't really focusing on as the end-all be-all of Christmas dinners either. Lasagna as a Christmas dinner is definitely a new one, but it's also an in-between. It's got meat, it's also got dairy. And if you really wanted to, it could also have vegetables. So it's the most agreeable middle ground we've been able to find so far. Lasagna really took off during the COVID era though, because thanks to the pandemic, people were shut in for the better part of 2 whole years in 2021 and 2022. That really makes those long winter nights so much more lonely, and as a result, the need for comfort food hits harder than ever. Lasagna was the perfect thing since it was easy to make at home and scratch the itch like nothing else, and it's also one of the most versatile dishes you can ever make. If you want to be vegetarian, you can do that. If you like your things gluten-free, there are an infinite amount of variations for you. If you want a plant-based lasagna, that's there too, and if you want something that's nothing but meat and cheese, then, well, history has definitely favored you. Basically, there was never anybody who didn't have a lasagna that was right up their alley. Plus, it was really good for social media. Home cooks started to really go all in on influencer culture and getting viral posts of dishes that looked good and tasted better, and a big part of that was focusing on stuff you could easily make at home. Lasagna was the poster boy for trends like that. Maybe you could say Garfield helped it pop off too. Thanks to COVID though, holidays weren't really as formal as they used to be. They just became casual celebrations, and a lot of them were spent indoors anyway. I think the most popular places for lasagna would have been around the Northeast and Midwest, and they even had seafood lasagna over there. However, people have started to go back to their usual pre-pandemic lifestyles again ever since it luckily ended, and lasagnas are starting to take a little bit of a backseat again in favor of more organic, dairy-free eating. Still, that doesn't mean they vanished like the rest of the stuff on our list has. They're still a big player in everyone's menus, and I doubt that's ever really going to change. Now, skirt steak might seem like a grilling cut, but it's incredibly delicious when slow braised. This dish involved slow cooking skirt steak until it became tender and succulent. The steak was typically braised with vegetables like onions, carrots, and celery, along with a rich broth or wine to enhance its flavor. Skirt steak is also traditional in Mexican cuisine, particularly in the north where it is known as arrachera. Braised skirt steak was often served with mashed potatoes or crusty bread to soak up the delicious sauce. This dish was a hit at sophisticated restaurants, but that doesn't mean your grandma couldn't whip it up. They're the best chefs after all. Go dust off some old cookbooks and you'll find a traditional recipe that won't disappoint. It's still a dish that's perfect for a cozy night in, a family gathering, or simply when you crave a warm and comforting meal. Pumpkin bread is also a Christmas comfort meal that you can find just about anywhere, and it was all the rage during the 70s. Recipes were being published in issues of cooking magazines like Good Housekeeping, which was a pretty big deal then. Anyway, people knew exactly what to do with their winter pumpkin harvest as they preserved the best of the best for Christmas. Most people also seem to think that it originated in Native America or from the Pumpkin Bread Media Cookbook. Either way, let's go over the flavor profile of this delicious bread a bit. You can expect some earthy notes as you bite into what seems to be the perfect holiday snack to start your Christmas with, as well as buttery walnut flavors with a velvety texture. Of course, if people had eggnogs and Yule log cakes, they had their cocktails, and retro rum punch definitely hits pretty hard, sometimes well above its weight class. A 1960s party cocktail that dominated the drinks menu of home events across America, retro rum punch was a really nice and easy drink to prepare. All you needed was some rum, orange mango juice, lemon juice, and some pineapple juice, and then some soda water. You could have a large punch bowl filled to the brim with these and have it empty before the guests leave, so most people always made some extra bowls just to be prepared. This is probably another thing that British Americans brought with them since it was typical in European countries, but we sure are glad they donated to the food scene of America with a pleasant rum punch. Also, it sounds so citrusy and tropical, we just would love to have a glass. So, braised veal with olives was a staple in English menus in the 18th century. This Mediterranean-inspired dish involved slow-cooking veal with a combination of olives, tomatoes, garlic, and white wine, resulting in a tender, flavorful meal. Similar dishes are familiar in the cuisines of other countries including France, Italy, Germany, Poland, and the Czech Republic. This dish was often served with crusty bread or mashed potatoes and was a hit at potlucks. So, why did this one fade away into history? Well, look around. Who eats veal anymore? Not me. But if your grandparents are ever craving a delicious bite of their childhood, you might want to whip this up for them. Although potato au gratin originated in 16th century Europe, its roots in the United States can be traced to French-American communities in North America. Gratin refers to a culinary technique where a dish is topped with a browned crust. This can be made using grated cheese or breadcrumbs, or even butter and eggs. In potato au gratin, most of the time people use grated cheese or breadcrumbs to add a crispier crunch to what is already a perfect combo of baked sliced potatoes, cream, and sometimes dates. Think of it as the ultimate version of baked mashed potatoes. Despite sounding fancy, it is actually one of the simplest dishes you can add to your holiday menu. Now, homemade eggnog is something that comes to our tables as naturally and certainly as snow falls to the ground. An absolute must-have that Christmas just does not feel complete without. Something that even overtakes the esteemed fireplace and hearth in terms of getting the Christmas cheer going, it is a favorite. Have you ever wondered when exactly it first got viral, though? You would have to go back all the way to the colonial times where it was really popular in medieval Europe, who eventually brought it with them to the American upper class as a Christmas treat. Since the ingredients were so simple and easy to get, normal people and households everywhere started making it too. While it is not as popular in homes in the 2020s as it once was, it is still an icon of Christmas cooking. First inspired by Count Pavel Alexandrovich Stroganoff in the 1800s, this Russian dish made its way to Christmas dinner tables during the 1970s across all of America, and for good reason. A good crock-pot beef stroganoff can set the entire family on fire, skipping all the usual pretense conversation that tends to take place during Christmas and going right to the pigging out part. The dish itself got some serious motion in the 1950s and 60s, but it got super popular during the 70s, especially in North America. During that period, you could not go to a single household without seeing somebody laying out a fat plate of stroganoff. Cubes of beef are served in a rich, creamy sauce with meat stewed in mushroom soup, Worcestershire sauce, and noodles. It sounds like a dream, and it tastes like one too. If you want to get real vintage for this Christmas, you know what part of our culinary golden days to revisit. Christmas morning coffee cake was a popular recipe to see even in magazines and cooking catalogs like Red Book, and that goes doubly true for the 1970s. Did you know that the trend is not strictly American, though? Back in the 1870s, a whole 100 years before the time we are discussing, German and Dutch immigrants started to come into America. Along with them, they brought their coffee cakes and all the traditional family recipes that had been passed on. Soon, in New York, New Jersey, and Delaware, the morning cake movement started off strong, and 100 years later, despite no one knowing its foreign history, it became a staple of Christmas culture. There was something so awfully warm and cozy about starting off a Christmas morning with a perfect hot coffee cake. Lamb shank and barley soup is another winter favorite that seems to have disappeared from our modern menus. Think fall-off-the-bone lamb shanks simmered in a flavorful broth with barley, fresh vegetables, and aromatic herbs. Barley added a nutty texture and made the soup even more filling. Sounds pretty good, right? Well, this soup was all the rave back in the day. Also known as the Scotch broth, it originated in Scotland in the early 19th century and made its way around to other countries in Europe. This soup was perfect for cold days, as it wasn't only comforting and delicious, but was also packed with nutrients. Since it was light on the pocket, the lamb shank and barley soup were prepared in large batches and enjoyed by families for several days. It had a long shelf life too. What more could anyone want? With the rise of pre-packed and instant soups, this labor-intensive meal has fallen out of flavor. But if you're ever craving this winter meal, there are millions of recipes all over the internet. So high pie is a traditional dish from the 17th century that might sound intimidating, but it's actually delicious and surprisingly easy to make. If you're ever feeling like whipping a fancy meal on a cold snow day, high pie is your best friend. If high pie doesn't ring a bell, you might know it as raised pie. Strike a note? This unique pie was made using a hot water crust pastry, which allowed the pie to be formed by hand into a high, sturdy shape. But here's the twist. Instead of a pastry crust, it's topped with a layer of mashed potatoes. The best part? It can be filled with anything from ground beef and vegetables to braised chicken. High pies were often reserved for special occasions or holidays, as they required significant time and effort to prepare. The hype for high pie has died down over time, but it's still a staple in some homes who can't seem to let it go, especially during the winter months. So apple bourbon pies took center stage in the latter half of the 20th century when bourbon-infused desserts became particularly popular. A lot of people already have apple pies and mince pies, so when they started to experiment with some other ingredients, a lot of state-to-state versions of this pie came about. Apple bourbon pie would taste very warm and rich in its flavor, and it was traditionally a part of a lot of festive celebrations in America. This would not be the last time that America would tangle with boozing up their baking either. A lot of alcohol-infused desserts would soon emerge in the period where the bourbon pie was elite. Typically, another party dish that would be served alongside such pies were slow cooker grape jelly meatballs. Now, the entire recipe and process might make you question what we are talking about here, but give us a minute and we will have you on board. See, people found out in their tinkering of American cuisine that jellies and sauces work together. particularly grape jelly and chili or barbecue sauce. They would typically be mixed in a slow cooker, then the meatballs were added, and it was cooked for 4 to 5 hours. We cannot be sure who made this yummy treat served on a toothpick, but community recipe collections around the 70s and 60s first featured the idea of mixing jelly and sauces. Maybe it came from a neighborhood one Merry Christmas night? Cioppino is a dish that not many Americans know about today, but one that had a massive chunk of the spotlight in the 70s and some pretty strong roots in the country overall. It was a deep tradition of the West Coast and Italian-American communities. Italian fishers that would come to San Francisco in the 1800s would add their catches of the day to this tomato and wine stew, and it eventually grew into its own thing, a niche stew that quickly captivated more and more communities. Soon, restaurants hopped on the bandwagon, and by the time of the 1900s, the Pacific Northwest and beyond had taken to cioppino pretty well. In the 1970s, cioppino was a must-have at Christmas, especially for those looking to add a more coastal or seafood theme to their holiday meal. A Christmas dinner is only as good as the sidekicks that accompany the center stage dishes and really make that spotlight shine so much brighter on the main courses you spent all night and day working on. No side dish does that, as well as honey-glazed spiced carrots, which were the appetizer of choice for all the Christmas parties in the 1970s. Most people would take this dish into a savory route by adding Moroccan glazes, but during the 70s, America was in the process of rediscovering its sweet tooth. One of the things that helped along the way was this perfect honey glaze, and it brought out a side of carrots that nobody ever knew existed. They just were not familiar with the game of a good honey-glazed carrot, especially if you put it next to some oranges and served it with maple sauce. The 70s were all about their fondue bars, fondue sections at menus, restaurants that specialized in it, and the infamous American fondue parties that took over the nation. Most homes had ceramic pots that were electric and came with 6 or 8 forks, and this was all for fondue preparation, as when Christmas rolled around, the last person you wanted to be was someone with no fondue in their home. Even in the Black Friday sales after Thanksgiving, people would go insane for those pots. Fondue was already getting a lot of traction in the 60s, but it peaked in popularity during the 70s thanks to it becoming sort of a dessert hobby for people to engage in. Kind of like how today we go out for hot pot as a social outing as well as a dinner experience, people would go out for fondue, trying it from different places and picking out their favorites. Ambrosia pudding pie was a dish that shook some culinary norms when it first came around because it has its roots in ambrosia salad. This salad was a traditional dish at American tables throughout the 30s to 50s and much of the early 20th century. A pretty citrusy and flavorful mix, it usually had things like coconut, mini marshmallows, oranges, and diced pineapple. First, people added whipped cream and cream dressings, which eventually led to using it as a pie filling in a beautifully presented pie crust. It was a real showstopper, the kind that would leave your in-laws speechless during dinner and gossiping non-stop after it. The crust is usually filled with either an ambrosia pudding or custard, and some states like the South would add fruits or nuts too. It definitely is something that is more of a nostalgic sweet than a current trend today, despite its strong pros. Ever since President Lincoln announced Thanksgiving in 1863, cranberry sauce with roast turkey has been a Christmas tradition that commemorates the holiday season. We know you might be more used to seeing fresh, plump turkeys during Thanksgiving, but it seems Americans love their cranberries. Of course, people never need a reason to get turkey going either, as they say. The more, the merrier. People usually serve some sprouts next to the turkey to make a complete piece. Plus, Americans really get serious about their cranberry sauce. Did you know around 5,062,500 gallons of jellied cranberry sauce gets served up during the holiday season? 20% of the entire sales for cranberries occur just after Thanksgiving in prep for Christmas. In the 1970s, brands like Ocean Spray's Mold Jar Holiday Cranberry Sauce were a real hit. Now we know what we're having for this winter. While we are not sure when exactly the craze for a prime rib roast started, most food historians seem to agree that it was a popular middle-class meal during the Industrial Revolution. That had to do with how meat butchering standards went decently up thanks to booming economies. so people started having high-quality beef as a regular dinner rather than a family celebration, especially for Christmas. Back in the days of 1970, you could get a prime rib for $2.75, which is an extreme steal compared to today's inflation. Plus, all the holiday discounts that tend to go on for expensive cuts of meat help make the public even more feral. A prime rib market during Christmas looks like a scene right out of Looney Tunes, really. You have grown adults acting like dogs over a steak. Beef marrow toasts was once a popular winter appetizer, but have become a rare sight on modern menus. This dish involved roasting beef marrow bones until the marrow was soft and spreadable, then serving it on toasted bread. The marrow's rich, buttery flavor, often enhanced with a sprinkle of sea salt and a squeeze of lemon juice, made it a decadent treat. Beef marrow toasts were a way to utilize every part of the animal, reflecting a time when resourcefulness in the kitchen was a necessity. The dish was both luxurious and rustic, providing a rich, satisfying start to a winter meal. However, as dietary preferences have shifted and convenience foods have become more prevalent, beef marrow toasts have fallen out of favor. Their disappearance marks the loss of a culinary tradition that celebrates the full use of an animal and the deep, rich flavors that come from traditional cooking methods. As long as we are speaking about Christmas appetizers and things that go great during a conversation, classic cornbread dressing is probably the holy grail of dishes like that. It was already something that was really popular in Southern American cuisine and states, and that was a habit America mostly picked up during the 19th century. Cornbread itself became pretty popular after the Civil War when corn was so cheap that it became mass-consumed. You might not know this, but even in the South, a lot of classic cornbread dishes dressing ideas were first popularized and tried in African American cooking communities. It was a bare-bones recipe with just cornbread crumbs originally mixed with some broth, but now it includes things like sausages, meats, onions, and herbs. Definitely one of the tastiest appetizers out there that we would love more of in today's Christmas scene. French onion soup gained popularity thanks to the dedicated efforts of Julia Child. Her cookbook, affectionately titled Mastering the Art of French Cooking, due to her love of French cuisine and what it did for food in America, had this dish as one of its classics. When people think about who made this dish rest on the tip of your tongue, or one of the ideas your mind flashes to immediately when asked about lunch plans, people seem to think of her first. Even on her television show, there would be actions of her whipping up some delectable French onion soup. The recipe was based on caramelized onions in this rich, beefy broth, and Julia Child was not the only one who saw the appeal. During the Kennedy administration, French food in general saw a big increase in fame and national interest thanks to the Kennedys' never-ending appreciation for French food. With a history as rich as the flavors you will find when you take that first sip, it is no wonder this became such a trendy choice for Christmas, though it does not have the same pull today with the people. Remember the slow cooker oxtail stew Grandma used to make during the holidays? Yeah, it wasn't everyone's cup of tea, but if you love oxtail, this is a winter dish straight out of your dreams. The invention of slow cookers in the 1970s made this dish a global hit, as you could make it without the need for constant attention. The oxtail is a cut of meat that requires longer to cook than you can imagine, and I'm sure you can connect the dots to why this one vanished from our dinner tables. Who has hours to spend on a stew nowadays? Well, if you ever find yourself stuck at home with nothing to do, the slow cooker oxtail stew won't only steal away your boredom, but also satisfy all those meat cravings. You just need the meat and then some vegetables like carrots, potatoes, and celery before cooking it all in a deeply flavored broth. Red wine or tomato-based stew both work wonders. This one will stick to your ribs and keep you warm on a cold winter night. People hang all kinds of Yule logs up during the merry season of Christmas, and Bûche de Noël happens to be one of them. Not sure what we mean. Did you know the name Bûche de Noël literally means Yule log? No wonder most of them are designed to look like an edible hunking log when you think about it now. Bakeries would have these being sold out in high demand and would really take some artistic and creative liberties with a design. Each place had its own kind of edible Yule log waiting for you, and all of them seemingly had the recipe nailed down just right. Bûche de Noël were a holiday regular for a long time. But lately, meringue mushrooms, powdered snow, and overly strong chocolate-based desserts have gone out of style. Speaking of garlic bread, it would often go great with some stuffed mushrooms, but they were good enough to stand on their own as a Christmas dish too. During Christmas parties and get-togethers, it was really common for families from all sorts of economic backgrounds to wild out and go heavy with the preparation. They would often include all kinds of dishes and make sure that entire snack bars, dessert bars, and tables were filled with all kinds of stuff. It was a common sight to see stuffed mushrooms sitting next to a fat roasted turkey and some garlic bread. The reason they work so well is because they already are infused with garlic, and sometimes even shallots. This means they work pretty well with the savory flavor that you will find in most Christmas dishes, not counting dessert. It warms you up perfectly for sweeter meals, although it is definitely more popular with adults. If you get the chance this Christmas, try out this vintage 70s classic. New England seafood casserole was a beloved winter dish in coastal communities. Seafood never really falls out of flavor, so this dish used to be a timeless classic. This casserole typically included a mix of shrimp, scallops, and white fish, combined with a creamy sauce made from milk, butter, and flour. It was often topped with breadcrumbs or crushed crackers. Now, traditional New England cuisine is known for a lack of strong spices, so if you've got a knack for spicy food, this might be a little bland for you. But for those of us who like to lay low on the spice, this casserole was a comforting and hearty meal, perfect for cold winter nights. Seafood casseroles aren't everyone's cup of tea, but it's definitely a dish worth trying at least once. People would often do a lot of their Christmas cooking a day in advance or in the afternoon before the big guests came, so having delicacies like make-ahead yeast rolls in the fridge was a common sight. These would be made in advance and typically frozen before they were ready to be baked. The best part about these rolls was that they were empathetic about the fact that you had a busy work schedule, and that is why they got so popular. People could just make entire batches of these and leave them in the fridge, waiting for just the right moment to begin baking them. You would never even be able to tell you were eating pre-made food because of how fresh it is and how soft the preparation makes it. It gets 2 rises to achieve the perfect fluffy consistency. All in all, this was a wonderful Christmas snack, and we would not mind if it came back. So cranberries make another guest feature on this list with apricot cranberry bread, which was another baked delight that people often had during the holidays and Christmas in particular. You might be starting to wonder why all the obsession with cranberries in Christmas. Is it something like mistletoe where it just has to be there? The answer is a bit of a yes and a bit of a no. See, the thing about America is that there are very few fruits that are native to the land and are commercially grown, cranberries being one of them. Given how they usually sprout during the winter season, people started symbolizing cranberries as a full American harvest, signifying a complete year. So you get all kinds of cranberry-oriented goodness like apricot bread, which goes incredibly great for comfy Christmas brunch for friends and family. When we talk about meringue snowballs, your head might go to shaved ice with flavorings shaped into a ball, but these little balls are in a league of their own entirely. These are made out of small cookie fillings and typically look like hollow domes. A small peek at the inside reveals an entire roller coaster of flavors to make your Christmas sparkle, and we are talking about a real heavy-hitting sugar show. Stuff like lemon jelly, candied chestnut, vanilla cream, and hazelnut praline. Pretty much a Baskin-Robbins shop into a delectable snowball. These are also pretty low calorically, which makes them the perfect thing to binge on while you get your holiday cheer-up. In the 1970s, meringue was the hottest thing in town. A flamboyant dish that people would order constantly at restaurants, with over-the-top presentation and flair to add onto a dish that needed no sales pitch to get you seated. Okay, this one might seem strange to modern plates, but mock turtle soup was once a luxurious and popular dish. It is an English soup that was created in the mid-18th century as an imitation of green turtle soup. It often used brains and organ meats, such as calf's head, to duplicate the texture and flavor of the original turtle meat after the green turtles used to make the original dish were hunted nearly to extinction. Now, before you wrinkle your nose, mock turtle soup was a staple at Victorian dinner tables. The original version is a bit off-putting, but nothing wrong with calf meat, right? In the United States, mock turtle soup eventually became more popular than the original dish and is still popular in Cincinnati. Of course, as turtles became more and more extinct, so did this dish that tried imitating their taste in a soup. But hey, it could be reinterpreted with plant-based alternatives for a delicious and cruelty-free twist on this classic winter soup. Who needs any introduction to the irresistible charm of spending the wintry holiday months with a basket of freshly baked garlic bread? Whether you order them from Pizza Hut or get them made in your home, garlic bread makes any Christmas plan that much more delicious. Let's get into the history of garlic bread in America a little too. So we know that it has been served in restaurants since the 1950s, and it would pretty much exclusively be paired with pasta dishes. Stuff like lasagna and spaghetti were common to serve some garlic bread with, but it was not until it became commercially manufactured in the 70s that the craze took off. Kohl's Quality Foods first made their version of accessible frozen garlic bread in Muskegon, Michigan, and we have to say they struck gold. The brand was massively popular, and it kicked garlic bread up a notch. Now people would eat it as is minus any main dish to go with. Rum balls were a confection that people adored in the early 20th century. It would typically be made of chocolate and some rum with crumbs of cookies or nuts mixed in for a crunchy sensation. It is not sure where they came from or who started them, but after their initial introduction in the early parts of the 20th century, they really spiked in popularity in the mid-half. Most variations would include powdered sugar and cocoa powder, and the idea itself was something a lot of Americans could get behind pretty easily. Bite-sized rum-soaked balls were not something you needed to ask anyone twice about us, including us, because if you saw these at the function, you were definitely stopping to get a couple. Despite how they have become known as Christmas meatballs, they actually consist more of pudding than anything else. Never thought a food could catfish, but here we are. Anyway, this is a pretty standard Christmas dish to go for. Things like this are always there for dessert or whenever you would visit your grandma for Christmas, but the idea of making them actual meatballs started blooming in the 70s and is probably why we have actual protein-filled Christmas snacks instead of pudding now. It seems that people realized you could make a turkey meatball just as good as any plum or figgy pudding and went with it. Not sure if they knew they were creating a trend that would sweep every household in the vicinity. Potato and beef ragu lasagna, a comforting winter dish, has largely vanished from family tables. This unique lasagna variation replaced traditional pasta sheets with thinly sliced potatoes layered with a rich beef ragu and bechamel sauce. The result was a hearty, satisfying meal that combined the flavors of a classic lasagna with the comforting texture of potatoes. The beef ragu, slow-cooked with tomatoes, onions, garlic, and red wine, provided a deep, robust flavor that perfectly complemented the creamy bechamel sauce. This dish was often topped with a layer of melted cheese, adding a golden, bubbly finish. Despite its deliciousness, the time-consuming preparation and the rise of more convenient meal options have led to its decline. The potato and beef ragu lasagna is now a rare treat, remembered fondly by those who enjoyed its comforting, rich flavors on cold winter nights. Baked ham. With a brown sugar glaze is an American favorite, and that relationship has stayed tight throughout many years in the 20th century. Ham as a meal, particularly baked ham, came from the first wave of Europeans who migrated to America. With British-American cuisine now in the play, baked ham became such a popular option on the dinner menu at their houses that other Americans got interested. Soon, everyone was having baked ham, and midway into the 20th century, people started messing around with different glazes. Once they stumbled on brown sugar, which added this hit of caramel and made the ham so much richer, it became a primary choice for Christmas for many years, until brown sugar as an ingredient became very rare in American cuisine. Beef coconut curry, a flavorful and aromatic dish, has become less common in modern kitchens. This dish combined tender pieces of beef with a rich, creamy coconut milk base, infused with spices like turmeric, coriander, cumin, and chili. The result was a deeply satisfying and warming meal, perfect for cold winter nights. The slow cooking process allowed the beef to become tender and absorb the complex flavors of the spices and coconut milk. Beef coconut curry was often served with rice or naan bread, making it a hearty and complete meal. Despite its delicious flavors, the time and effort required to prepare a homemade curry have contributed to its decline. The rise of ready-made curry sauces and takeout options has also played a role in the disappearance of this traditional dish. For those who remember it, beef coconut curry remains a beloved winter comfort food, evoking memories of family gatherings and home-cooked meals. Now, braised sweetbreads, a once popular winter delicacy, have become a rare sight on modern menus. Sweetbreads, which are the thymus or pancreas glands of young animals, were braised with a variety of ingredients, including onions, garlic, and white wine. The slow cooking process resulted in a tender, flavorful dish that was both rich and satisfying. Sweetbreads have a unique, delicate texture that pairs well with a variety of sauces, from creamy to tangy. This dish was often served with vegetables and potatoes, making it a complete and hearty meal. However, as tastes and dietary preferences have evolved, and with the decline in traditional cooking methods, braised sweetbreads have become less common. Their disappearance marks the loss of a culinary tradition that celebrates the full use of an animal and the complex flavors that come from traditional braising techniques. Another thing that was an incredible classic during the 70s was baked ham with a brown sugar glaze. We cannot express how much the local townsfolk in places like Oregon and Alaska would love to make this, and it was especially popular in the South of America. People already had an obsession with ham, and the 70s was pushing it to the max, with things like Spam becoming even more popular. The days of baked ham were also not that far away, and retro baked ham recipes involve brown sugar glazes with maraschino cherries to add literally the sweetest cherry on top to your perfect winter dessert. Some recipes even include ginger ale, creating a sweet and savory dish that never fails to impress guests. With that, we wrap up the last 100 years of Christmas food. Comment down below which decade stands out to you as we get ready for the festive days. Don't forget to like and subscribe while at it.